Hello. I see my friends in the front row. Good to be here, and this photo will hopefully make sense by the end of the talk. I spent a huge amount of time creating that photo. I don't know if you see, but I've inserted a €2 coin into a mountain bike. And I'm not really a graphic designer, so actually this was a lot of work. But I quite like it. I even did these lighting effects. And the basic idea here is I'm trying to reclaim the Luddite movement, as it were. I don't know how many of you guys know about the Luddite movement, but it was a group of people who were attacking machines back in the 1800s. And they're often vilified as being anti-progress and basically anti-progress. But I think the Luddite movement is going to have a resurgence in the coming years, and actually what the Luddite movement's all about. Maybe the neo-Luddite movement. What it's about is restating what progress actually means and having a more balanced idea of what progress means. Because right now, the way that progress is defined is a very particular vision of progress. And I think the mountain bike, in a way, kind of encapsulates maybe the neo-Luddite movement, because it's a kind of like a semi-low-tech kind of piece of equipment, but it's also, I don't know, we'll discuss it as I go into the talk. You can see what you guys think about this. I never quite know how to introduce myself. I go by many different names, but actually yesterday when I was checking in to this conference, the person who was doing the accreditation referred to me as, she said, "Oh, you're the cash legend." Which I don't quite know what that means, but I think I'm going to claim this title, the cash legend. Because when I talk about cash, I talk about literal physical cash. I've been noticing that some people at Republica have been using the term cash to refer to money in general. But when I talk about cash, I mean literal physical cash. All right? So I guess I'm one of the people right now in the world who's trying to provide an alternative vision for cashless society, trying to reclaim what it means I guess to have a kind of balanced monetary system with different forms of money. And today I'm going to try and take you through some of that. I have a book out about this as well, if you're interested. And this came out last year in May. And it's out in a bunch of different languages, probably about 9 languages now. This is the new paperback version that will be coming out in July this year. If you want, there's actually copies of the book at the Dussman's stand down there. And I'm happy to sign them if you want. But basically, this book is about, in broad terms, the fusion between big finance and big tech. All right? It's about the growing amalgamation between big banks and big tech companies, but also how this then plays out in the monetary system, and in particular, about how it plays out in an attack on cash. Now, if you live in Berlin, you probably haven't noticed this fully yet. Berlin still actually has quite high levels of cash usage. But if you go to a place like London, you will see how this is accelerated incredibly. It's becoming very, very hard to use cash in a place like London. And you're starting to actually feel the big finance and the big tech companies almost seeping into the environment. It changes the entire feeling of the city, all right, where basically everything starts to go through these mega institutions, and you actually cannot interact with a society unless you interact with these institutions. And this book is about that process and about how we have these narratives about why cash is in decline. And the narrative is always that somehow it's ordinary people who are demanding this. But if you zoom out and you look at the big structural processes in the global economy, actually what's happening is mass automation at the level of finance and tech. And this is what's leading to a structural attack on the cash system, but also an ideological attack on the cash system, which is starting to seep into our culture. And this book is basically going through that. Now, in the process of releasing this book, I've got a huge amount of flack, all right? I get lots and lots of attacks from people who basically think that there's something futile about trying to protect the cash system, all right? And this is with this term Luddite. I get called a Luddite, like a person who's against progress. But also there's a growing number of people who are starting to associate a pro-cash position with conspiracy theorists. They say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist if you think there's something wrong with cashless society. Even in Germany, where I now live in Berlin, lots of people on the far right have started to sort of promote this pro-cash thing. And people on the sort of center-left so often these kind of like urban sort of liberal people are starting to become a bit like sketchy about promoting cash. They think that maybe it's going to be associated with conspiracy theorists of the right. And it's becoming a big problem in terms of the politics of this issue. So what I want to do today is to try and give the progressive argument for the protection of cash and what to do if you're faced with people who are very pro-cashless society and you want to be able to actually articulately give an articulate account for why cash is super important for maintaining the balance of power in a monetary system. All right, so that's the basic mission. You guys into it? Okay, good. I feel like I got like the graveyard shift here, but I love the enthusiasm nevertheless. Okay, so I'm going to do this in a few steps, and each of these steps is basically going to try and help you to understand the process I go through when I'm trying to defend the cash system. Like the first thing you got to do when you're thinking about this issue around cash versus digital money is to understand the global meta-narrative that we are subsumed under all the time. And this goes way beyond the issue of cash and physical cash. This applies to many, many different industries, many different areas. Wherever I go to in the world, no matter what stage I'm on, no matter what forum I'm in, business leaders and political leaders will endlessly talk about the digital transition. All right? It's a kind of a mantra that's endlessly repeated. I was at the Brussels Economic Forum a few weeks ago, and literally every single speaker who got up, these sort of policymakers, all recited a mantra about the inevitable digital transition that they were helping to try to bring forward. All right? It's a deep ideological construct in the world right now, and the basic idea is that what progress is ever more speed, scale, and interconnection brought about by digital automation. Now, if you look at this narrative, it's actually the latest in, I would just call it capitalist automation narratives. For the last few hundred years, we've had the same process repeating with many different technologies, where there's always a leading edge of technology, and the leading edge is always like what is accelerating the system and expanding our system. Right now in the world, digital technology is accelerating the capitalist system and expanding it. So at an ideological level, it's the one untouchable thing. And so this whole endless digitization type of narrative comes, in my perspective, and you might disagree with me, out of corporate capitalist ideology, because this is what you use to expand and scale systems, is digital technology. All right? Now, this applies to any industry across the world, not just payments. And actually, you'll find a series of sub-narratives that this major narrative generates. And you'll probably be noticing these right now, for example, in the AI debate. These will start to be popping up in any kind of digital debate. All right? So the first sort of like sub-narrative is the idea that this digital transition is not only inevitable, but there's a race towards it. You'll find all sorts of stories about a race to AI and a race to cashlessness and a race to whatever it is, okay? And you're encouraged in the situation to keep up with this race and to not be left behind, right? You've got to, and if you don't want to lead the way in this race, you better like adapt or sort of just get used to it, right? Because there's no way of escaping it, okay? That in turn generates a secondary narrative, which is the left behind narrative, which says, if you do not do this adaptation, you will be left behind, all right? And that's a very bad thing, because you'll basically be chucked off the edge of society in a sense. In a way, it's a little bit like being thrown off the back of a treadmill. Okay, it's like if you sort of slow down, you're going to be ejected off the back of our economic system. That in turn generates an inclusion narrative, which says we better save everybody who's about to be left behind. All right? So we better get, for example, the state to onboard people into these new systems, or we better find a series of initiatives to onboard people into the inevitable digital trajectory, for they fear they'll be left behind. And there's a related narrative, which is the delay narrative, which is to say, give them more time to catch up. Everybody who isn't yet using the new systems, sort of slow down the transition a bit so they can kind of have time to be included and catch up to this process. I guarantee you in the next like 6 months with AI, this will start to play out. We're probably in the kind of like stage 1 of the AI debate right now, where it's all like, oh, this is so exciting, isn't it? Who's leading the way? It'll soon be, the left behind narrative will come soon after, saying if you don't use AI, you'll be left behind. And then we better find a whole bunch of programs to include people into the system, otherwise they'll be like basically screwed. All right? Now, if you want to understand the payments version of this is where the sort of anti-cash narrative comes in. All right? cash is a non-automated physical form of money. So under the context of the digital ideology, or that acceleration and expansion ideology, basically cash is cast as something that's slowing down the system. It's causing friction. It's something you basically can't automate, right? So you'll find all those sub-narratives playing out in this debate around cash. So for example, one of the most common things you'll see with stuff about cashless society is this imagined race towards cashless society, all right? And you can see there's this idea of these players or countries who are sort of running towards this cashless system, and some are being left behind. You know, Vietnam, Japan, and Thailand are still behind, all right? And one of the fascinating things about these concepts of races is that nobody ever agrees to join these races, right? It's just something you're sort of told. You're told that you're part of this inevitable trajectory. And this, of course, then generates, according to the overarching ideology, a left-behind narrative, all right? So there's loads and loads of stories. If you go to the UK right now, you'll find tons of stories about the problem of all the people who will be left behind by cashless society, all right? And it's always about vulnerable groups and people who can't get access to bank accounts, and it's like, and this generates, in turn, the inclusion narrative. It says, oh, well, we better get the British state, and we better get the banking sector to work together to basically onboard everybody into the banking sector, all right? I remember being on this show with this guy from Citigroup, and Citigroup is obviously a massive bank that provides the so-called cashless systems. And the guy was asked, he was like, what do you think the biggest problem of cashless society is? And he said, ensuring that everybody is included. That was his answer, right? Basically, like, ensuring that everybody becomes a client of my bank is the major problem, right? Because some people are not yet clients. And he's like, we must work with the state to onboard people into our systems, all right? So it's very much like, imagine like a McDonald's executive is asked, what's the major problem with McDonald's? And he's like, making sure that everybody has access to McDonald's, all right? Because some people don't yet have it. So we must help people get on board with McDonald's. This is literally this narrative, right? All these people are not yet onboarded into corporate capitalism. We better find a way to onboard them, okay? And along with this comes an upgrade myth, all right? This idea that basically what digital money is a kind of upgrade to physical money, all right? Something that's just sort of naturally emerging. And you can see this if you type digital money into a search engine. You always get this kind of like story about that what digital money is some kind of like cash dissolving into data, or like cash coming out of a computer, or cash flying through wires, right? It's this idea that there's, what is it? It's like a digital form of cash that's more advanced than the cash form. And cash basically ends up getting cast as the horse cart of payments, all right? And you can see how this also goes on with those inclusion narratives. Like, you can imagine in the early 1900s, people who were into cars saying, shit, you know, my granddad still uses his horse cart. You know, it's like, well, he's a bit of an old timer. He'll eventually get used to the new world of cars, okay? This is very much how many politicians present this issue around cash right now. They say, oh, yeah, there's still some old people who use cash. There's still some people who rely upon it. They'll eventually get used to the inevitable transition and give them some time, all right? But more than this, we'll have it actually being demonized, right? So the anti-cash proponents, and there are many of them around the world right now, will cast it as being old, inefficient, and dangerous, all right? And they'll compare it to a new, efficient, and safe digital systems. And they say, it's naturally going to happen that everybody organically wants to upgrade to these digital systems, all right? And along with this is a political narrative about why this happens. So this diagram is slightly obscure, but it's this is a diagram that I use to represent how I think about economies, okay? Any economy is a giant sort of mesh of interdependent people. We're all like locked together, all right, in a huge sort of interdependent mesh. And in the middle of that there are all the big corporations, okay? So you can imagine this diagram as being like if you're looking at a pyramid from above, all right? So you have these big sort of like players in the middle, and then it sort of spreads out into the peripheries, right? So on the streets, all the ordinary sort of people walking around doing transactions, this is sort of the outskirts, and then all the big kind of corporate players in the middle. And in the sort of narrative around cashless society, we have this idea that agency lies in the outskirts. So the reason why this is all happening is because ordinary people are choosing to make it happen. Well, everyone just naturally sees that the desire to upgrade to digital systems, and these players in the middle simply respond to the demand. They're like, almost like a servant who says, we see what you want and we will provide it for you. Right? This is a standard part of corporate ideology, the idea that corporations are mere servants that respond to our demands, rather than active players who try to shape your demands and try to shape systems in their favor. Okay, so this is the sort of state of play right now when we're thinking about the cash system. Can I have some water? Okay. In the remaining part of this talk, what I want to do is introduce two ways to destabilize that narrative, all right? And I'm going to introduce two sort of bodies of metaphor to do this. So part 3 and 4 here are kind of like tactics to use once you've understood the meta-narratives that are at play in the overarching debate. Okay, so the first is this concept of the casino chip society. And I've crossed out cashless there because what the cashless society is essentially a society where you're relying upon, well, I'll go into this. You'll see what I mean. All right. Well, okay, one of the biggest problems we have right now when you deal with money systems in the public domain is what I would call myself the one type of money illusion. So many people believe that, for example, the euro or the pound or the dollar is a single currency, right? They'll sort of see it as being this sort of singular thing, and it has maybe a digital form and a physical form, but it's a singular kind of currency. A bit like, comparing a electric guitar to an acoustic guitar. You're like, well, they're basically both guitars, but one's like slightly automated and one's not. All right? So people have got this idea that there's this one type of money in society, when in reality, actually, there's multiple forms of money in society, and they all go under the same name. All right? So the euro actually has multiple different issuers, multiple different layers, and multiple different forms. They all go under the single term euro. All right? And one of the easiest ways to grasp this and to understand this is through the metaphor of a casino. Okay, so if I go to a casino and I hand in cash to the cashier, they will hand me chips. All right? Those chips are a secondary form of money issued out by a private player, a casino, that can be used within the confines of the casino. All right? And I can then take them back and redeem them back for cash at some point. But you can see there's a conceptual difference between the cash held by the casino and the chips that I use. All right? Those are two different forms issued by two different players. Okay? And actually, this is very similar to what happens with the banking sector. So all those units that you see in your bank account are essentially privately issued digital casino chips issued by the banking sector. All right, so if you hand cash into a bank, they don't hold that cash for you. They take ownership of that cash, and they issue out these digital casino chips to you. Right? It's the same that even if you get digital transfers, in the background, this is what's happening. You're receiving bank-issued digital casino chips. What's referred to as the cashless society is a situation where you basically become totally dependent upon these second-tier, corporate-issued, privately issued digital casino chips. There are some nuances to this. One of the great superpowers that banks have that casinos do not have is that banks are able to issue out far more of these digital chips than they have in cash, right? In reserves, as it were. And this is sometimes called fractional reserve banking, more accurately referred to as credit creation of money. Basically, banks can push out these chips into society to mobilize whole sections of the economy when they're giving out loans. All right? So there's a huge power thing going on with the bank's ability to create money like this, create the second-tier form of money. Okay. But the basic point is that all those units you see in your bank account are a privately issued form of money issued out by the banking sector. And every time if you're here buying coffee with your contactless card or something, you're being routed through a huge system, through an oligopoly of banks that basically have a background system for moving these digital chips between themselves. All right? And Visa and MasterCard and all these players get involved. This is a somewhat obscure picture. On my, I have a Substack where I sometimes draw these pictures of the monetary system, and this is one of my earlier ones, and it basically shows the banking sector hovering over society, and the processes that happen when you're sort of pinging your card on one of those terminals, and it's pinging through these data center structures. But the basic point is they are transferring these digital chips between themselves, and they're getting fees and huge amounts of data in the process, and there's a huge industry around this, all right? And they have a massive agenda in promoting a cashless society. And this means when you go, for example, to an ATM, the way you should be thinking about it is you're taking those digital casino chips that have been issued out by the banking sector, and you're redeeming them back for state money, a bit like going to the casino cashier and saying, I want to exit your system. All right? So when you go to the ATM, you're basically exiting the banking system. You're exiting that sort of secondary form of money. And so this becomes very important in the context of what's happening in places like the UK. Right now in Berlin, you can still easily go to ATMs. You can still go to bank branches. But in places like the UK, it's becoming super, super difficult. And basically, it's a bit like a casino saying, we're not going to allow you to redeem your chips anymore. We're not going to allow you to exit our systems. You'll be permanently stuck in our systems. You will only be able to use our digital casino chips, as it were. Now, what happens when you can't cash with your digital chips? There's a bunch of issues, and this is the sort of first line of concerns about cashless society. For a start, there's a legal problem. Imagine you went to a casino and they refused to redeem your chips for you. You could basically sue them and say you're reneging upon your promise. Those casino chips that I'm holding basically only have power because they are redeemable back for cash. All right? As soon as you can't redeem them, there's a huge legal issue, but there's also a massive financial stability issue. The reason that you believe in those chips is that you believe that they can be redeemed back for state money. It's the same thing with those bank units. The reason people believe in the cashless systems, as it were, is that they believe at some level those units are redeemable back for state money. And I'll let you in on something here. If you are following the digital euro debates, and there's probably some talks at this event about it. Actually, the Bundesbank has got a stand about it somewhere there. The reason why the digital euro debates are happening right now is central bankers know about this. They know that there's a huge problem, that if the cash system goes down, there's going to be massive public, basically a crisis of confidence in the digital systems, right? So those digital casino chips, basically the public loses belief in them if they cannot be redeemed for cash. So ironically, cashless systems depend upon the cash system to give them their very legitimacy and stability. Now, this is more of like a technical kind of point. Many people in the public don't really see this. They don't really understand this so much. It's more of a kind of a background structural issue about the monetary system. So when I'm dealing with people sort of more on a kind of day-to-day basis who are not really interested in the sort of legal and financial stability issues of this, I will use a different metaphor. And I'm going to go into it after I have some water here. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the way that the digital payments industry and many people who are being caught up in digital ideology will present cash as being the horse cart of payments, all right? Competing against some kind of sports car of payments. If you want to rewire this narrative and you want to totally change the perspective, all you need to do is this here, all right? So you cast cash as being the bicycle of payments and the digital systems as being the Uber of payments. And it immediately shifts the power dynamic, and immediately shifts, it breaks people out of this kind of digital ideology in a way, because actually you start to realize that our society is full of systems that are slower and less automated, but we actually value them deeply, all right? And I can give you many examples of this. For example, we might enjoy a fast lift in a skyscraper, but that doesn't mean that you've asked for these stairs to be removed from the skyscraper, right? In most systems, you want to keep a balance of power between the different elements of the system, and this creates resilience in your system, right? And it's very similar with the transport system. If you're designing a resilient transport system, you want to have a balance of power between the different players. And this is why I like this metaphor, because actually, I don't have a problem with Uber. I actually use Uber quite a bit, right? But I do not want Uber to be the only form of transport in the transport system. I want the ability to use a bicycle too. And this is the best way to start thinking about the payment system as well. Cash is not the horse cart of payments, it's like the bicycle of payments. Or maybe it's like the mountain bike of payments, depending on which of those you prefer. This is a very good thought experiment as well, because once you can start to tease out the problems that emerge when this balance of power is disturbed. You can imagine what would happen in a society where Uber was the only form of transport. So right now, you perceive Uber as being convenient, right? One of the reasons that you perceive it as being positive is that you have the option to not use it. right? You have alternatives available. In the situation where you have no alternatives available, that's when all the negative sides come out. And you can imagine what would happen in a society where your only means of transport was Uber. You'd have massive problems of centralization of power. You'd have a massive attack on your autonomy, essentially. You wouldn't be able to move without this entity giving you permission. You'd have huge surveillance problems, right? You'd also have massive resilience problems. If the system goes down, your entire system freezes up. You would have massive exclusion problems too, right? If you can't access a system, or if you don't want to access a system, you wouldn't be able to move. And it would basically be an attack on localization as well. Any attempt to move would have to go through a huge central entity all the time. And this is one of the best ways to think about this cash debate. Often when you're debating people about cash, they want to get you into this either-or style of thinking, like only using cash or only using digital. But the point about any monetary system is that you can get a balance of power between the different types. And the two sort of components that you have in the cash system is that you have autonomy over it. You have personal control over the cash system. Plus, it runs on a public infrastructure. It's a public system. All right? The private systems, they might be convenient, but you build a huge amount of dependence upon them, and they rely upon private infrastructures that are built upon public infrastructures. Now, we in general don't necessarily mind moderate degrees of dependence, but when you have total dependence, that's when all the problems emerge in a society. So I'll quickly, in the last few minutes, I'll sketch out the main sort of categories of problems that emerge when this balance of power is destabilized. So one of the first ones, of course, is that you have huge resilience problems. Cashless systems, or these digital systems, are hugely vulnerable to systems failure. I was even at a music festival in the UK recently where they basically were forcing everyone to use these cashless systems, and the internet went down, and the entire festival basically ground to a halt, all right? And some of the vendors still had cash facilities, so they were able to get money, but the main beer tent in the festival was turning away hundreds of people who were trying to get beer, right? So it was sort of like convenient in a very sort of like narrow sense, but deeply, deeply vulnerable to systems failure. And there's many examples you can give of this type of issue in these systems. The second big category of problems that emerges is about inclusion versus exclusion. The cash system is inherently inclusive, all right? It's a public infrastructure. You don't need permission to use it. You basically don't need any form of account. So one of the big issues around inclusion is people who can't get access to accounts, but more deeply, people who are deliberately excluded from accounts. So if you're looking at authoritarian systems, if you want to exclude people by basically banning them from using digital systems, you can shut out their ability to survive. All right? And this is becoming a huge issue in people's concerns about the control that you can exert via digital payments when cash isn't an option to use. Another big category of concerns that people have, and this is one of the biggest ones people often think about, is privacy versus surveillance. And it's worth thinking about this in balance of power terms. Sometimes it's useful to have certain degrees of transparency in society, but you don't want total surveillance, right? So cash provides that bulwark against total surveillance. But there are other deeper ones as well. Localization versus centralization. I don't have time to go into this, but basically when you start to look at what's happening in cashless society, you're having a huge transfer of power to these centralized entities. This basically means that even the smallest interaction at a local scale always benefits a large player, a large distant player. So if you want to maintain any form of local economy, it basically becomes impossible in these types of systems because every single small-scale local transaction basically makes a large central entity bigger and more powerful. Finally, actually there's two more to go. This one's a bit more obscure. We're often told that frictionlessness is a natural good because under the digital ideology, it's imagined that endless acceleration and expansion is naturally good. But when you start to look at one of the main reasons people use cash, it's to actually slow down spending. The reason why people from lower socioeconomic groups will use cash is often for budgeting purposes. And there's loads of studies that show digital payments basically accelerate spending. This here comes from Visa in its benefits of going cashless page, right? Visa has a massive agenda, obviously, in promoting digital payments because they make huge amounts of fees from it. And they try to sell it like this, by saying people spend 25 to 40% more with digital payments. So if you basically force people to use digital, you will make more money, all right? But this has huge implications for indebtedness, people with mental health, all sorts of issues like that. And then my last 40 seconds, the final category, which is actually one of the most obscure, but also one of the most important, I think, is the balance of power between informal systems and formal systems. One of the reasons why Berlin feels so alive to many people is it's got a good balance of power between informal and formal. All right? You've got big state structures that underpin certain things and corporations, but there's also a lot of community spaces. There's lots of peer-to-peer spaces. It has a kind of sort of edginess that sort of coexists with the formal systems. And most people actually like a balance of power between formal and informal. But often informal economies are demonized in sort of modern and many sort of mainstream circles. But if you think about what informal economies often are, it's friends playing poker at home together. It's a kid selling lemonade on the street, It's like an honesty box on a farm in rural part of a country, right? And there's many of these sort of small-scale situations where cash actually makes a lot more intuitive sense to people. But imagine what happens when basically these digital corporates like Visa, MasterCard, banking sector, basically creep into even the smallest of these informal interactions. It changes the entire vibe of your society. Now, this is one of the hardest arguments to make, especially to kind of mainstream policymakers. They kind of like glaze over when you say this. But I think this is actually one of the most important things that's at stake here. What do you want your society to feel like? Do you want to feel basically MasterCard's executives breathing over you every single time you're doing even the smallest thing in the society? And I'm going to end there. And I hope you enjoyed this. And I hope you can make use of this framework to start to build arguments for the promotion of cash. And I thank you for your attention.